Woohoo, in the quiet library. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. It's wonderful to be in the library. This is the first time that Ars Poetica has been back in the library since the pandemic began, and it's also my first time having the privilege to host an Ars Poetica here in the library. I'm now in my third year. I'm Nick Neely, an assistant professor in English writing here at EOU. And thank you so much for coming out, whether online or here in person, for tonight's Ars Poetica reading featuring Adrienne Shirk, who's come all the way from New York to be with us tonight. Her book is called Heaven is a Place on Earth, Searching for an American Utopia. She'll be reading for us, and then we'll be in conversation with me for a bit before we turn it over to the floor for questions. And I'd like to thank Carl and Sandra Ellison and their Ars Poetica Fund for supporting tonight's program. And thanks to the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences for its support as well. Tonight's event is a featured event related to the college's inaugural theme, Utopia. And we pretty much hit the topic on the nose with Adrienne and her book. It's really, I'd also like to thank Stephanie Brown, librarian here, and the other librarians for curating a really awesome theme display. We have dystopia on this side, I believe, and utopia on that side. I'd encourage you to browse around afterward and see if anything catches your fancy. I believe you can just check these books right out to continue your reading. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Jessica Holmes, my colleague in English writing, who's really led the charge in terms of organizing the Utopia theme this year. Thank you, Jessica. And finally, thanks to Devon Nanaski and Sheldon Beatty, who are running the show, the streaming show from us in the back. We appreciate you. As we set off, I wanted to begin with a brief land acknowledgement, which I acknowledge is an inadequate gesture by far, but a place to begin conversation from. Many of us, well, we're here in LeGrand, and those of you online, some of you are probably also in LeGrand, so I would like to say we humbly acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land Eastern Oregon University is upon, the Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Nez Perce people. We celebrate their traditions, languages, and stories. We acknowledge their continuing connection to this land, water, and community, and pay our respects to these original stewards of Northeastern Oregon. It's now my pleasure to introduce Adrienne, who, and her book, Heaven is a Place on Earth. The publisher says about the book, told in a series of essays that balance memoir with fieldwork, Heaven is a Place on Earth is an idiosyncratic study of American utopian experiments, from the Shakers to the radical fairy communes of Short Mountain to the Bronx rebuilding movement, through the lens of one woman's quest to create a more communal life in a time of unending economic and social precarity. Kirkus Reviews calls the book, quote, a sprawling synthesis of memoir and social history, and a rigorous personalized argument for the continued relevance of an old idea. Adrienne Shirk is also the author of And Your Daughters Shall Prophecy, Stories from the Byways of American Women and Religion, which was named an NPR Best Book of 2017. Raised in Portland, Oregon, she now lives at the Mutual Aid Society, a cooperative living experiment of her own design in the Catskill Mountains, and she teaches in Pratt Institute's BFA Creative Writing program. Her essays have appeared in The Atlantic and Atlas Obscura, among other publications. Heaven on Earth, from my perspective, is really an ambitious, tenderling, formally inventive work of nonfiction. It's the kind of book I relish and the kind of book I long to write. Chimeric in its approach, it sophisticatedly weds reportage, memoir, history, and public intellectualism. In this way, it seems something of a utopic project itself. Adrienne's voice is honest and wry, darting and driven, and there's unexpected insight, introspection, and synthesis on almost every page here. The book is truly driven by a passionate curiosity, especially the fundamental, ever-pressing, and classic essayistic question, how should one live? I'm thrilled that she made the long trip to be with us tonight. Welcome, Adrian.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you to Nick Neely for coordinating and organizing and communicating with me, and to Eastern Oregon University and the College of Arts, Sciences, and Humanities, maybe in that order, maybe not. But a body I really appreciate for bringing me out here. I'm going to read from Heaven, in a kind of piecemeal way, a few chunks that I thought might be fun, interesting, troubling to read to this particular group, and thinking about just the different experiments and learning engagements you've been doing around this theme. We'll see if my selections correctly reflect those things or not, but I'm going to go ahead and let you know as I sort of rove between different pieces, and I'll give you a little bit of context for each one. I'm going to begin with the first full essay, which is called The Utopia Notes. The pursuit of utopia is, at its heart, about our relationship with time. Utopians sit around dreaming about the beginning and the end as a way to decide what to build in the present. What kind of human community will heal the scars of the past and ensure a brighter future? Which systems or relationships do we wish would last forever but will only ever be temporary? What will the end be like? And is there an end? And should we make it look like what we imagine the Edenic beginning looked like, if ever there was one? There are other factors, of course, to each her own utopia, but when the particulars are wiped away, the common questions are often temporal. Book writing is very similar. When I started working on this book, I was 28 years old, and by the time I finish, I will be 32. A 4-year period where my own responses to these basically rhetorical questions would at once be fulfilled and rendered obsolete by the end of the process, which, like all books, and all utopias for that matter, has no real end. Before I was conscious of this being a book, I had been dimly aware for some time that I was writing about American utopian communities. I had been reading and watching YouTube videos and visiting communes and staring at my laptop, lost in my own personal utopian yearnings. I was writing a lot, reams of things that I referred to, even in the privacy of my own mind, as just notes. And I had finally amassed something like 120 individual Word files titled things like Utopia, Nashville, Utopia, Bruderhof, Utopia, Woman House, etc. Each of these files contained floating narratives, orphaned thoughts, direct experiences, embarrassing disclosures, desperate prayers, voyeuristic observations, rants, passages from books, stolen photos, copy and pasted emails. I watched as the files piled up, and I kept thinking that any day now a shape would start to coalesce. I kept waiting for the notes to build toward the kind of legibility that I so admired in other books about utopianism. But instead, I just kept on with the notes. Utopia, Caliban and the Witch. Utopia, North American Phalanx. Utopia, Jenny Lewis. Utopia, Soul City, and on and on. A friend of mine, who was also an old teacher of mine, finally suggested that I just print out all the writing and look at it together. And so I did. And that was when I was 28. I was sitting at my desk over the hot stack of freshly printed writing, and suddenly I thought, oh shit, this is my book. All of this stuff, all of these little things that I kept thinking were the precursor or the thing that was eventually going to make way for the real book, in fact, was the book. This was what I had to work with. This was what I had had to work with the whole time. It was a powerful moment, for sure, but its power lasted only as long as I could stay out of its way, which was not very long at all. By that point, there were like 150 pages of words which had been doing their own thing for years, creating a form, synthesizing information, telling a story without my own purpose or plan to guide it. Yet, I failed to heed its inner logic, this interior intelligence of the writing, and instead, now that I had printed it out and had really started working on the book, I thought, excellent. Now I can discipline this writing into what it's supposed to be, a playful but straightforward social history of American utopian experiments. There's a funny parallel between this moment of writing a book about utopian experimentation and the act of utopian experimentation itself. If I had listened closely to my own words, the ones I had already been writing, I might have known that sooner than later. A utopia is often only as good as its ability to be just out of reach, slightly beyond the understanding of its makers, eluding authorial intent. When a utopia becomes too self-conscious, too sure of itself and its aims, too top-down in its execution of a vision, it tends to teeter, to eat itself like an Ouroboros, collapse, terrorize, become the butt of its own joke. The utopian notes themselves had created a record of this arc, but they also offered an antidote or a response to this problem in their very form. Because if the history of utopian experimentation is largely a comic-tragic tale of brief triumphs of collective innovation, followed by sometimes seismic fracture and failure, followed by more collective innovation and then more failure, then whatever value there may be in engaging utopian thought must be about process, not progress, experiment and not end result, accumulation of notes and acceptance of no final conclusion. So the utopia notes build. Each new entry is a valuable contribution to an ever-growing body of knowledge, introducing new directions, possibilities, ideas, desires, needs, and detours. So what is your utopia note? All of that was already clear in the writing, but I pressed on anyway for 2 years, determined to produce that clear, confident, highly readable pop nonfiction book about the history of American utopias. A kind of writing which I imagined might be a perfectly rendered utopia itself. And in retrospect, this had a lot to do with my assumptions that utopian experimentation at that time was about progress, where now it seems like it really is actually about fracture and layering and failure. And maybe that is where the two things form meaning for me, the making of a utopia and the writing of a book about the making of utopia. It doesn't really matter if you do it right, or get out of its way, or wield power over its ultimate meaning, because I never did let go of that Platonic ideal of my utopia book. And the egomaniacs and boy kings and bad theologies never stopped trying to build their heavens on earth either, but the quest for utopia persists anyway, and so did the book. But as soon as I start relying on the word utopia, it becomes a misnomer, in part because it is often a word used as a jab, no place, to trivialize, to characterize a project that is too naive, too implausible, too irresponsible, too out there to work. We might think we know what we're talking about when we talk about utopia, but it's never a one-note definition. Its assertive no place immediately suggests that it's an imaginative term, or as Alex Zamalin defines it in Black Utopia, a radical act of philosophical speculation that has a long history predating Thomas More's novel and extending forever into the future. For my purposes, I use utopia as an earnest critical term, never a pejorative. A term which I use again and again to refract my belief that a better world is in fact fucking possible, even if I'm not sure how. I only know that I have to take that seriously, even if it means I'll mess it up. In order to even approach utopian thinking, says Avery F. Gordon in her amazing compendium of utopian conversations, the Hawthorne Archive, we have to stop associating the utopian with the impossibly idealistic, and then using it as a weapon against others and ourselves. If we cast it as never worth thinking about, then we won't. We'll stay right where we are, taping up the crappy cardboard infrastructure of the current system because utopian dreaming is only for losers. And utopia, to me, doesn't mean just any community or thing that has formed out of its own need to practically survive, but specifically projects that have intentionally understood themselves as world building. World building a way out of a death-dealing system in the service of making, if only briefly, some idea of heaven on earth, not just for themselves, but, however foolhardy, for all of humankind. That is the utopian scale, eschatological. It's crazy. Zamalin says, utopia is like religion, not because of dogmatic theology or secular truths that it postulates, but because it conjures powerful, irrepressible, sometimes ecstatic feelings of salvation, of being at home in the world, and of reconciliation with strife. I'm going to read now a couple of pages from another chapter called Fellow Travelers on the Road to Nowhere. I'm going to hop in the middle, but for context, this chapter is thinking about a lot of different figures throughout the 19th and 20th century who weren't necessarily builders of like communes or liberation movements or these kinds of things, but they were like obsessed with, joining them. And they would like join them all over the place, like they would travel around and seek out who was doing the kind of new cool utopian thing, and they were writers. So so it's these like fellow travelers that I'm calling them, who kind of leave this huge record for us of like what kinds of utopian activities were happening during their lifetime, even though they were kind of like, utopian migrants. And so the person that I'm going to jump in with is this guy from the mid-19th century named A.J. MacDonald, who has this huge body of work, just like notes and paintings and wood engravings and things that he was recording when he was kind of moving around all these communities during the 19th century, which now live at Yale. So we're going to jump in with in the middle of A.J. MacDonald's story. A.J. MacDonald spent time at the Shaker Colony, Watervliet, near Albany, New York, and he helped found the Fourierist Claremont Phalanx in Cincinnati, and he stopped in at the Prairie Home Community for Universal Thought and Inquiry in Ohio, the South Union Shaker Village in Kentucky, the fully cooperative city of modern times out on the Long Island Isthmus, the Raritan Bay Community, the North American Phalanx, and many others. He would often catch these communities, typically, it seems, near or at their ends, almost when they were about to fall apart. But that's mostly because these communities had shelf lives under 5 years, and sometimes as brief as 5 months. So MacDonald would do what he could to help out and scramble to record their existence by pen or by wood or by paint, and then he would move on to the next. The scholarly notes appended to MacDonald's archive at Yale indicate that some of his writings, were extracted from his Travels in Search of Employment essay, a manuscript not present in the collection and one whose title suggests to me that his immigration from Great Britain may have been driven by economics and with his research on utopians, a valuable but ancillary project. There's something bumbly and incidental then about his quest. He was perhaps fleeing the fallout of the Panic of 1837, a massive global recession, and he was drawn into this examination of utopias unconsciously. It reminds me of a much more famous utopian groupie, the author Nathaniel Hawthorne, who joined the transcendentalist Brook Farm, inspired by Fourierism, in western Massachusetts for just a year, among other hopeful, anemic artists and their fledgling apple trees, in order to save up enough cash to propose to his girlfriend. Once Hawthorne had enough money, he promptly left Brook Farm's collectivist fold, though he did, of course, later write The Blithedale Romance, a bestseller based on his experiences at the Commune. For MacDonald, though, it was different. What began as something defined chiefly by practical need, where the research acted as a vessel for him to figure something out about how to live and how to make a livelihood, eventually became the life. MacDonald's susceptibility to this quest reminds me that being a utopian groupie, being a utopian really of any degree, is also always sort of about looking for home, reaching back for a home dimly remembered, a home dreamed of in the future, a home you are hoping to construct in the present, but which you also accept may be an exercise in perpetual wandering. Nonetheless, it is a home where you and everyone else will finally be free. The definitions of freedom vary, of course, depending on belief or background, but in the mid-19th century and now, utopian freedom follows a few constant themes. Freedom of bondage, of capitalism, of private ownership, of waged labor, freedom from government, freedom from patriarchal marriage, and freedom from the nuclear family unit, freedom from sex, or freedom to have as much sex as you want, freedom from God, or freedom with God. I mean freedom here, though, more along the lines of how Annie Dillard describes freedom in regard to the act of writing, which she calls life at its most free. But there's a caveat. She says, your freedom as a writer is not freedom of expression in the sense of wild blurting. You may not let rip. It is life at its most free if you are fortunate enough to be able to try it, because you select your materials, you invent your task, and you pace yourself. The obverse of this freedom, of course, is that your work is so meaningless, so fully for yourself alone, and so worthless to the world that no one except you cares whether you do it well or ever. Alternatively, I might mean freedom here more along the lines that D.H. Lawrence intones in his weird mystic essay, Spirit of Place. He says, men are free when they are obeying some deep inward voice of religious belief, not when they are escaping to some wild west. The most unfree souls go west and shout of freedom. The shout is a rattling of chains, always was. Reflecting on the work of poet Gwendolyn Brooks, critic Hanif Abdurraqib writes that she was, quote, writing of black Chicagoans' triumphs and failures and understanding those things as whole and complete life at the intersection of those. And perhaps, he says, that is freedom more than anything. Or maybe I mean freedom in the way Audre Lorde means the erotic, which she describes as, quote, a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings. It is an internal sense of satisfaction to which, once we have experienced it, we know we can aspire. For having experienced the fullness of this depth of feeling and recognizing its power, in honor and self-respect, we can require no less of ourselves. It does sometimes feel outrageous for me, a white Anglo-American woman, to use the word freedom so blithely or to work after a definition when it is Black Americans who taught this country everything it will ever know about freedom. But freedom is also something that my white Irish ex-in-laws talked about a lot, connected as they felt to the Irish liberation movement that their ancestors had fought in, the pride they felt as the descendants of Irish peasants, but who had now been upwardly mobile white people in the suburbs of New York City for 3 generations. I found this attachment to rebelhood by white people suspect, and yet I would sing along enthusiastically to Grace and Danny Boy with my father-in-law Dan on his back porch in the little cabin he was renting on Lake Wacabuck the year before he had the Strokes. I loved those songs. But I felt ambivalent about the whole thing, about white ethnic people rooting themselves in a resistance tradition that they had never added to, until years later I went to an old Irish bar in Riverdale in the Bronx, a neighborhood in the upper northwest corner of the Bronx. The bar was called An Bale Bacht. Sweeney had heard that there was a woman with the voice of an angel who sang there every Friday at 6 o'clock. I pictured in my head this woman, young and blonde and lithe, but blessedly, when we walked into the dim bar side of the room, wheeling Dan in, accompanied by his favorite aide, there she was, the singer. She was in her 60s, and she was queer as the day she was born, with close-cropped gray hair, with her wife by her side, a navy blue t-shirt, jeans, and an Irish brogue. We ordered beers and listened to her sing. Dan requested that she play Grace, and she did, which she accompanied with the story of her visit to Joseph Plunkett's gravesite. And then she sang such a beautiful, full-throated version of it. And later, as she sang the Ballad of Joe McDonnell, a song about the Irish prison hunger strikers in the 1980s, I froze. And you dare to call me a terrorist while you look down your gun, when I think of all the deeds that you have done. You have plundered many nations, divided many lands. You have terrorized their people. You ruled with an iron hand, and you brought this reign of terror to my land. She could have been singing a liberation song for any colonized country. For queer liberation, for Black liberation, for any liberation movement. The way that the melody works is beautiful. It lilts up and down. It does not terminate. It keeps flowing over the mountains and the rivers. It never stops. And that, too, is a real claim to freedom seeking. I'm going to end with a utopia note, the very first one that appears in the book. There are utopia notes scattered between each of the chapters throughout the book. They begin and end the book. And what they include, you'll have to find out when you read the book. But they are these kind of resting sites, and they are made up of this kind of original impulse of the note-keeping, of things that seemed attached to developing an understanding or a practice of the activity of utopia. And so the first one is called Utopia Notes, Cruising. Amber, Laura, and I are driving through the back roads just outside of Nashville, away from Percy Priest Lake, singing along to Belinda Carlisle's 1987 ballad, Heaven is a Place on Earth. We're steaming in our damp swimsuits from the heat. Yellow poplars and crepe myrtles and sugar maples rush by the windows on the winding road back to Amber's house. The chorus mounts to its third and final iteration through the car speakers. Laura, sitting shotgun, speaks back to the song. I've always liked this part, you know, where she goes, "We'll make heaven a place on earth. Heaven is a place on earth." Like, that was fast, Belinda. Laura and I have flown down from New York City for a weekend-length writing retreat in our friend Amber's living room. All three of us are currently reading the book Cruising Utopia by Jose Esteban Munoz, and we've been passing it back and forth as we leave it bookmarked on the coffee table. We are thinking, along with him, about how utopia is or can be any gesture that points to a better future, a gesture of futurity that he finds repeated over and over and over again in the symbols and praxis of queer life, especially in the decades prior to the technocrat takeover of things like New York's Pride March, which is a week away at that moment and so corporate now as to be a figment of the outlaw queer imagination. Utopianism, for Munoz, is something that is necessarily always in process, something that is simultaneously aspired to down the road and ushered into the present, the now future. I keep thinking of the way that 1960s and 70s gay liberationists named their organizations. The names always struck me as the kinds of gestures that Munoz is talking about, names that point toward but also make present a world much larger, lovelier, and more fun than ours. Daughters of Bilitis, Gay Pagans, Alice B. Toklas Democratic Club, Council of Grand Dukes and Duchesses of San Francisco, Order of Displaced Okies, Local Lesbian Association Kazoo Marching Band, Dykes on Bikes, Imperial Silver Fox Court, Lavender Menace, Lesbian Avengers, Free Beach Activists, Society of Janus, The Furies. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. I loved your serenading of us. That was special and unexpected. We're going to do a quick set change here. Just move the lectern out of the way. Okay. Oh, didn't spill. Impressive. Again, am I on here? All right. Thank you so much. That was a powerful reading, and I'm glad that you toured us a little through the book. A quick question, just to start on the Utopia notes. They are really a place of rest. I love how you put that, and they're so delightful in that they are much less sort of expository than other points of the book. But my question is, how many of the original Utopia notes were absorbed into the larger chapters, or did you just sort of eventually throw out many of them?
Most of the book, which I actually want to be clear about this too, because I also spent a great deal of time like metabolizing and structuring and revising and shaping and creating artifice around those original notes. So it's not as though a book literally came together through the sort of haphazard stitching together of notes that took exactly the form, that they're currently in. But, and I think this was really instructive for me, I would say like almost all of the writing that made up that kind of generative utopia note-taking practice was absorbed into the book in one form or another. Maybe not literally all of those words or sentences, but the interests and the ideas and the things that were being chronicled and insight or things overheard. Yeah, it really was like the fund. And this came up so many times with students that I was visiting with in classes today, in terms of how they were describing their own writing practices, but it was like a slab. It was like creating the the raw material and then just kind of working with it.
That's great. It sort of leads me to a second question, which is at the end of your first chapter, and I love this perhaps because I've written a travelogue. You position yourself less a historian or a reporter and more of a traveler, each site or community or question functioning as a kind of prompt and interrupt for my ability to imagine a future for myself and others. It seemed to me in this sense you're sort of a time traveler as well in your exploration of history, and you're also very much on this kind of ambitious intellectual journey, an interpersonal one. And so this is very active traveling, right? This is not your sort of mundane tourism. You've got your eyes wide open in many directions. So I'm wondering, can you talk about how you gave attention to all those many layers, and whether you set out to make it as layered a book as it is?
Boy, I'll actually go in reverse order. I did not intend for the book to be, I think, as layered as it ended up being. I think that sense of layering I ended up having to obey what it was. And which partially meant like about, composing it in the way that it was actually kind of coming to me, composing it, representing in the finished text itself, kind of even formally, like the way that it felt to learn about and live through some of these things, the way that was layered. And then I think the importance that kind of ended up being key in the research itself was how much utopian experimentation history was layered and was, in multiple ways. It was physically layered, happening in similar sites over and over again, and also layered in terms of, one generation grafting or borrowing ideas or structures from a previous one. And so I think I really resisted the layering because I thought it was going to be unintelligible. And so I was really trying to kind of, force the work into like, long, complete, rhythmic, even chapters. And it wouldn't sing. But when I was finally able to kind of obey the weirdness of the form, it actually felt like alive. But it again, I say all this stuff that it sort of sounds woo-woo, but there's a lot of labor involved, but it does also kind of have to do with like, figuring out how the form is going to be responsive to what you're actually writing about. In terms of like the traveling, right? The sense of like, wow, there's certainly a lot of like traveling through time and research through texts and different histories. And then there's also, a lot of moments in the book where I am showing up somewhere. I'm visiting a community, or I'm visiting a project, or I'm in a different town, or I'm on the road. And it almost kind of looks like the chronicle of a life of somebody who's kind of doing this all the time, which is not true. And it's actually really interesting to me because my boyfriend's mother recently told me that she was like, oh, you've lived such an adventurous life, you've traveled so much. And I was like, God, no, I feel like I've lived like a very conservative life. The books represent the extent of all the traveling I've done. Like the books were what gave me permission to spend time and energy and attention and money traveling, and in ways I don't think I would have given myself the permission to do. So I don't know, there's a symbiotic relationship between like what a book project, allows me to turn into, a kind of investigator and adventurer, but a person I wouldn't otherwise like let myself be.
Well, it's good you're writing these books then, and you're amazingly efficient in what you glean from your travels. I'm curious, a follow-up question is, you visit all these mainly small communities, some of them ephemeral, as is the nature, and vulnerable, or communities that are marginalized, that are kind of rebels with a real cause, but are on edge. Did you find that you were able to gain access easily? What were some of the sort of challenges that you encountered there?
Yeah, generally yes, which follows just something I feel like I've learned over the course of not just my adult life, but my younger life too, which is that mostly people are really happy to have someone be curious about them, and to be, mostly people are super responsive and receptive to expressed interest and contact, especially if your reason for wanting to be in communication with them is not because you is just because you're interested. and I think it would be different if I was a journalist in any like meaningful way, or if I was even like an academic, if I had like some kind of formal training or research methodology. Not that those things are bad at all, but I think it would be harder to trust me, because they would assume I already had an idea that I was kind of trying to prove. So I think showing up to them as like an artist who had just personally as a human like common questions, and that I had some like respect for the ways that they were working within their own kind of belief or value systems, even if I didn't share it, generally was met with a lot of openness. I think there were some, but I think the vast majority of, not all of them, but the vast majority of communities that I actually went and visited were largely majority white communities. And I think and also like there were a couple of like pretty long-standing queer communes in Middle Tennessee that I also, one of whom I reached out to because I had a friend connection, but they had kind of a seasonal event that they were going to be doing privately, so I didn't push. Another one didn't reach out or didn't respond to me, and I think those are communities. So I say this because I'm thinking like, yeah, I think there was also some sensitivity on my part around if I was going to be like entering into or invading someone's community, just like what my own responsibility was in terms of like what kind of power or privilege did I have, and to just sort of weigh that, I think, against like who I was asking to kind of be vulnerable with me. So, I mean, these are, I guess, some of the considerations. There was one community that I visited that asked to review what I wrote about them.
Did you?
Well, I mean, that's a long story, but I decided ethically, I was like, I will show them the proofs. It'll be quite a long time before publication, so if there's any really, really serious ethical quandaries, we can figure it out still. So I sent it to the woman that had hosted me, and never heard anything back. And then when the book came out, I got a very tersely worded email from her. So I forwarded the previous email that I sent with the date. And I never heard back. So, and that's unfortunate. She wasn't actually, and she wrote back to me tersely, not because she was upset about what was being written, but she was like, what about our agreement? So it's complicated, but
Yeah.
that was a particular case. All that is to say, reach out to people. People love it when you are curious and interested in them.
There's a fun moment in the book where you write to a community and you say, oh, I would really love to come down and write about you. And then as soon as they reply, you realize, oh, I should never put it exactly that way. I should just say, oh, I have got things I want to work out for myself. And
Which was also true. I'm like, oh, I should lead with the like, I'm just a human trying to figure out how to live, and I can also tell them I'm a writer and that I'm working on a book about communitarianism.
There's some great chapters about Oregon history in this book that I wanted to touch upon, considering where we are. And the first is called The Ancestors, in which you tie your family history and some of the history of Oregon's colonial founding, unsettling founding, as it were, well, settler colonialism, but very unsettling in retrospect. You tie it to notions of utopia. I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little about that and how this exploration made you rethink what you knew or felt about Oregon, where you grew up.
Yeah, all of my ancestors, not all of them, the vast majority of my ancestors on both my paternal and maternal sides were really key in the unsettling of Oregon and Washington in the 19th century, like really directly. And I knew that because it was just like an ambient part of my upbringing. It was just like, storytelling, and definitely like older family members sort of like doing a lot of work in, to convey all of this history and this legacy. And it was just sort of a feature, and I think as I aged, yeah, and I began to understand how complicated that was as a legacy, in part because, I think the generation that was telegraphing the information to me did not feel complicated about that legacy. And so I had to, arrive at that feeling or that understanding later. And I think, so that's like, carrying that around and thinking a lot about that. And when I was working on this book, they suddenly just that story and those roots and their role in kind of creating what we are, where we currently are in terms of as a political and bordered unit, suddenly started to feel like it was a corollary between utopianism, one way of thinking about it, like manifest destiny, and their particular activities, not just as unsettlers, but as people, as a really particular kind of empire building, which you can see, which there's a long record of, about actually like trying to create an all-white state in Oregon through a lot of very, very particular like measures and laws that extended really like into the 20th century. And while, of course, there was all kinds of like violent and racist unsettling happening like all over the United States, Oregon was very unique in its like explicit intent to create an all-white state. And the way in which the writers of these laws and the creators, and of the cities in which, that were going to bear out this society, believed that to be like a good. And really, and defended it at length. And so as I began to kind of dig into some of those materials and the records of those histories, part of what I was just trying to get close to was like, what is this dream? what are they freeing them? What do they think they're freeing themselves of? Like, what does this have to do with beliefs about about whiteness and blankness and purity and all of these, and I was trying to kind of get close to that, and as I was writing into it and gathering some of this research and thinking actually a lot, like working with a lot of indigenous scholars who've thought a lot about like what is wrong, like what is wrong with these like colonizing Anglo people. We think it has something to do with their like complete disassociation from place, from landscape, from an Anglo specifically, from an identification with land, in particular land, because of the successive kind of takeovers and obliteration of indigenous like English life, going back like going back into really like the 800s. And it was really compelling, as an idea. And I started to think about Oregon and this sort of really just like frightening history that my ancestors engaged in, as this like really scary project of trying to create their own indigenous identity. Yeah, on this, in this place that they had to kind of like brutally, destroy like culture and people to create, and that like while those laws and those, and those cultural contexts changed on some level or shifted over time, that like we're living in the echo of that, like that like. That it, it's with us. Like we as people just inhabiting bodies in Oregon, like it needs to be. We still need to like wrestle with it and speak back to it and notice it.
The book does a terrific job of sort of challenging our interpretations of history and revealing histories we need to know. And that their chapter on Oregon seems a great example of your assertion that utopia and dystopia are the division is they teeter on the same edge. I'm not saying that quite right, but you know what I mean. One slips into the other.
One is on this shelf and one is on this shelf, and they're looking right at each other.
Right. Yes, exactly. So I have many more questions, but let's open it up to the audience because we're short on time. What questions do you have for Adrian?
I know, I'm like...
So you were talking about this... Where do I stand?
I think that's great.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're talking about how utopian committees kind of... they have this process of destruction and rising again. Did you find something in common or a principle for the ones that managed to fail gracefully? Like the ones that managed to maintain cooperation instead of coercion and things like that?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think the ones, there's a few ways to think about this, because I'm like, the ones that fail gracefully, and it's like, well, what do we even mean by that? But let's say like no one kills anyone, no one dies, like no like major harm is done. Or I'm also thinking, I'm like, well, and also there have been tons of like communitarian projects that have lasted for a really long time. I think of like the Bruderhof movement is like this communitarian movement that has lasted for like 100, over 100 years in a decentralized way. Or, the farm in Tennessee is about 50 years old, and Twin Oaks in Virginia is over 50 years old. And, the Camp Hill movement is over 100 years old, and so I'm like, okay, longevity longevity and graceful disassembly. I think it usually, the theme that I notice is that God, I know what I'm trying to say, but the words are over here. When the material, when the dissolution had to do with material like issues, i.e., we have no more money, or some major sustaining resource is like no longer renewable. When the communities that have fallen apart or disassembled gracefully are the ones who understood that fundamentally they may be trying to share political or spiritual or theological beliefs and values, but that those things are always going to be, kind of inconsistent or jagged, but the thing that is firm and factual that they share is like their mutually beneficial, material survival strategies that they're responsible to each other for. And the ones who understood that, regardless of whether they also shared political or theological beliefs, were also the ones who were able to disassemble, without harm, when their ability to mutually support each other materially faded. I think the most kind of harmful, right, catastrophes or fractures or failures are when they're issuing from like an ideological, spiritual, theological disagreement, right? That from a place of kind of like, abstraction, that's where people start to, that's where violence takes place and harm takes place in terms of the falling apart or a suddenness. But yeah, the movements that like really understood, despite their, again, high values, wild spiritual beliefs, who really understood the kind of like centrality of material life, and how they were stewarding that for each other, were the ones who were able to exit. And I'm like, that's everything from like, I don't know, the Amana colonies to like Black Mountain College. These are two kind of completely arbitrary examples to put side by side. But one is this like, German Proto-German into the United States, huge communitarian, millenarian, like we're waiting for the end of the world in our egalitarian communes, Christian pietist movement, to like a groovy 26-year educational experiment in the mountains of North Carolina. I think of both of those communities as having been able to disassemble gracefully, because they understood this kind of, this key thing that they were responsible to each other for. The world didn't end, and Black Mountain College didn't change higher education forever. And that's okay. Now we have Amana air conditioners. And we still have liberal arts schools. Sorry. That was a really good question. I'm sorry I answered it in such a strange way.
No, it's good. Other questions?
Okay. Yeah, my question has to do general curiosity about the ever-growing online community and the potential to maybe nurture, for better or worse, or for true or more of a veneer of like an online commune. I'm sure that exists. I don't know of one, but I can only assume. And so I guess it's a two-part question. Did you come across that much, or did you want to solely focus on physical communes?
Also a great question. I mean, I guess I'll say this. I definitely, in terms of the pursuits of the book, was very much so looking at things that people had done together IRL, right, whether historically or presently. I think the question you're asking is huge, but it also then begs important. But then it also begs questions about things that I am really not skilled at talking about. But just the internet is was dreamed of as like a free space, as like a technology that was like invented by hippies, and like deeply came out of like the counterculture movements and literal people leading countercultural movements in the 60s and early 70s. Like those were the people. That was Silicon Valley. And I do actually write about this a bit in the book, thinking about that legacy and thinking about like so many of those actors, like really just cashing in. Like you can see them in these threshold moments in like the 70s and 80s, thinking about like, the internet is this like amazing collective good. Like this is going to be like an amazing tool to sort of collectivize resources, and it's going to solve all these issues. And then you can see the moment that like all of these people begin to accrue so much power and money that suddenly, that this beautiful kind of utopian vision of the internet, was sold. And it's interesting because the technology, like it still possesses the ability, to imagine things like an online commune. I mean, and obviously there are many ways that people are using the internet in outlaw fashions, like for good. But so I don't know. I'm like, yeah, I like that. I love the idea of the liberatory possibilities of the internet. And I love the idea that that's possible in part because what's that guy who did Whole Earth Catalog? Stuart Brand, like the Whole Earth Catalog guy. He's in the architecture of the internet. Like he's one of the people who dreamed up the internet, even if he went evil later. If there's some way in which like that architecture, this digital architecture, has these capacities, that mirrored things that were capable of communitarianism and collective good. I'm like, surely we can take it back. I just don't know how. You should write that book. We need someone to write that book. Well, that's the other thing, right? It's harder to write an adventure story on the internet.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's a great question.
Other questions? I think we have time for one or two more. I don't want to squelch questions. I've got. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm afraid my question might be too personal, and if it is, don't answer it. But it sounded like from the introduction that you are living in maybe your own kind of social experiment in the Catskills, and I was curious if it must have come from what you've learned from writing this book, and I'm curious about how you've arranged that or what it entails.
Great, thank you. No, not too personal at all. I write about it in the book also, which is to say, yeah. I'll briefly, the book begins at a huge kind of crisis moment when I was about 26, when my father-in-law survived a series of debilitating strokes at 58. And my then husband and I became his sole caretakers, his primary caretakers for the next 5 years. And we were living kind of on the edge of New York City and working more than full time and taking care of who was my still young father-in-law, and like barely surviving. And about 2 years into that process is kind of when I started writing this book. And part of that, I think, impulse was like a grappling hook, because I didn't feel like we had any way out at the time, but at least I could dip into this like history and this present every once in a while, even if it was just through notes or YouTube videos or books, and dream and think and experience how people had survived like societies that were not designed to allow them to live in various ways. And so from that place, the book begins, and the book eventually, like the process of writing the book, I think eventually allowed me to be able to imagine and think a little more thoroughly about like what other kinds of ways we could live, especially if we have to think about supporting, at the time, my father-in-law, for we didn't know how much more time and what kinds of living situations we could imagine including him in. And so I had changed, a few years into writing this book. The book had changed me. The research had informed some imagination and imaginative possibilities. And I don't know, a whole bunch of stuff happened, but eventually I ended up buying a house in a community with some people I knew in the Catskills who were nearby, and kind of building a life and a kind of member-supported cooperative living and residency and art retreat space, which is now kind of where I live. I've lived here for about 3 years. So it's my home, and it's also the Mutual Aid Society, which has about 8 kind of cooperators, not all of whom live there, but everyone has kind of we have like a set of cooperativized resources that we all kind of share and support. And it has served as the home of a variety of people over the last 3 years, as well as kind of a set of open source studios and venues, and there have been a variety of organizations who've needed places to kind of retreat or summit or plan or organize, who've come and kind of made use of that space. And it's been, and I think the thing that it was served by in terms of like immersing myself in these histories and strategies is that I had a large toolbox, I guess, of structures to kind of test out, specifically around like, okay, centering material need, i.e., at the very least, what this is providing is something that, anywhere from like 8 to 50 people, depending on what's going on, can afford and access in a way that we would never ever be able to on our own. So we can marshal collective resources, we can be our own rich uncle together, and because the vast majority of people who are in collaboration around this are artists, social workers, teachers, organizers, and like all people who are under remunerated workers and who really don't have any plans of ever or ability, if they're going to remain in those vocations, of ever making much more money than they are now, it felt really like necessary to then figure out like, well, how are we going to kind of collectively create some ways to give ourselves some access, space, security, a place that people need, when someone needs to kind of fall apart or recharge or make something or gather or summit or invent something, we can do that. But it's evolved. I think maybe that's the biggest thing that the book offered that process was that it needs to constantly re-understand itself. And so I feel like it's been like every year we go through kind of a process of looking at like what is actually happening and what has actually happened, and then kind of describing that and creating some structures and agreements going forward. And then we live through another year, and then we go, what actually happened and what is actually happening? And we do some revisions and we go forward and so on. But I think the idea that it's a cooperative experiment has to always be living and allowed to, allowed to change, I think has been really key. Yeah, that there has to be reflection, and and then you have to be kind of obedient to that process. And when you're not, like the book and like the utopia, when you're trying to make it something that you think it's supposed to be, it will rebel. So listen to what it is and then create, structures that maintain and create safety around that. But it's a cooperative experiment. Yeah. Totally. Well, and maybe actually that's a really good point, is that I think there's so many, right, families, neighborhoods, blocks, right? There's so many forms that this takes place, and I think perhaps like a lot of my peers who I've been in collaboration with around this didn't have, right? Didn't have the block or the neighborhood or the, or they were in some way estranged from or separate from an intergenerational family context, right? And so it's okay, well, if you don't have those things, then how can we just create a structure that can provide some of that, that is not necessarily just like a residential commune, right? So I think a really important principle of that experiment has been that it's not, it's not primarily a residential project, though people have come and lived for different periods of time, but that it's, that it's a resource that we are mutually responsible for, and it's a network of familial contacts. Yeah.
I know I want to come visit the Mutual Aid Society sometime.
Really? I feel like I just described it in a bizarre way.
I feel energized to start one here, and we'll see how I feel about that in the morning. You're on a campus. You get to kind of also live inside a system of mutual aid. Everyone here. It's true. And we're going to think more about that over the course of this academic year as we continue to think about utopia. I wanted to thank Adrienne Shirks for being here tonight and for all your great insights and for your wonderful reading. And thanks to everyone who came out in person and to those online. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nick. Thank you. Sheldon.
We have books for sale if anyone would like one. I'm sure Adrienne would love to sign it for you.
I would.
Thanks so much again.
Thank you.